Okay, again, doing this for differentiation of videos, so I'm not uploading them directly to YouTube. There have been people out there, I don't want to start ripping on people, um, but, who, it just back and forth, I mean, I keep asking, what's your Skype? Let's talk, because they say things that are so, like, insane. I mean, it's unreal. These are people who claim to be Christians, or according to them, they're Christians, and they have no concept of what went down. They know that they reject the Roman Catholic Church. Well, no, they don't. They know that they do reject the Roman Catholic Church. It's just they're not. They just. It's basically myth and legend. It's very strange. And I think it's a view that's held that. I mean, there's so many variants of the strange view that's held. So I'm just going to give a basic rundown of what happened through the years, and I don't know, might span a few videos or whatever. But this is just the basic thing that would happen. I don't know if this isn't cited either to be Eastern Orthodox, Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Anglican, Roman Catholic. So I'm not citing it in any. Basically, everyone agrees on these. Even atheists agree on this. There's a guy known as Jesus, who his followers called the Christ, the awaited Christ, because there was like Daniel gives about a 200-year period where the Christ can come, has to come at that point. So there was tons of people who would call themselves Christ. I mean, even there was a group that claimed to be the followers of John the Baptist that call him Christ, and they're old. I mean, they're at least from before the time of Islam. So in the book of Acts, talks about the followers of John years after the crucifixion. So they're still around. So there was just, there were a lot of messiahs, the last one being Bar Kokhba in 135 AD, and in 135 AD, the Romans said, we've had enough. But I'll lead up to that. Hold on. So you have this guy, Jesus, called Christ, sometimes Jesus of Nazareth, who his followers thought were the Christ. You get Christianity spreading like a wildfire. From that point, it just spreads all over, and the message is pretty much the same. There's a miracle worker called Christ, named Christ. There's this new way. It's this totally new religion, and it's monotheistic. So Rome didn't like that. Plus, they kept talking about a new kingdom and stuff like this, and Christ was their king, and wouldn't burn incense to the emperor, which is, it's kind of like giving the middle finger to the emperor, basically. That's how they saw it. So they were put to death and beaten, tortured, whatever. They were considered an enemy. And then there was, you have Nero blaming, in the 60s, you have Nero blaming the Jews for the burning of Rome. You have people like Tacitus and Pliny and Josephus write about it. Josephus was commissioned to write a work about what went down in Palestine, because there was a hell of a lot that went down. And he mentions Jesus, among other people, being crucified. There was many ancient Jewish lists that list false messiahs, and Jesus and John the Baptist get listed in there among with all these other people. But you had Mark come around, and the date people put for Mark is 50. It's 50 to 60, around there. I go earlier with it. The Apocalypse of John, I think, is in the 60s. Protestants will put it in the 90s, because they figure, oh, it's written by John. That was the original reasoning. Was to, the Apocalypse of John is by John, which I still know. I know many people who think that. And when I mean John the Apostle. So you have the Book of Mark that's written, and then you have two other books that come out that obviously are using a template of Mark, which is Matthew and Luke. And they have infancy narratives in them, and later on, much later times, there was a constant trying to expand the infancies. So you have, about the second or third century of the earliest one is Infancy Gospel of James, and that's probably from the early 2nd century. And then Thomas, which is probably from the early 3rd. You have this guy Paul writing like crazy even before this, even before the time of these Gospels coming out. John, many people would place last. I would place that second. I'd say it went Mark, John, and then the other two Gospels. Matthew is obviously written to the Jews. Mark is very strange because it's this passion narrative with this quickly moving story in front of it. And I think the word immediately, because there's some translations, they try to go word for word. There's only one of them that I know that actually does it. And it has immediately like 28 times within the first chapter. And if you've seen chapters of the Bible, I mean, they're short, It's kind of like surahs in the Quran. Well, surahs are different. They're like, al-Baqarah and stuff like that. So you have Paul running around spreading Christianity, as you do other people too. The cities that grow with Christians are Rome, southern Anatolia, many villages and cities in Greece, Antioch and Alexandria. And that's just by the times, by the year basically 60 or 70. And then you have it, spread to the rest of the empire. And this was a real problem. I mean, because if you read about the martyrdom accounts in North Africa, it's pretty crazy. I mean, Irenaeus was in Lyon. He was in France. I mean, and you had, it's crazy. But then you have the people who knew John and the people who knew Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul are basically like, well, John, Peter, and Paul are like their evangelistic record survives better than many others. Like, we know Thomas went to India, Mark into Egypt. Whether it took and it was flourished from them, or whether they were killed off and a memory of them was retained there, and then when it became Christian, they said, oh yeah, so then you have the people that John taught, because John was John was an Ephesus for a while. He was around southern Turkey, basically, or God, I gotta call it Turkey, Anatolia in Syria, and he traveled. And Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp were two of his students. They knew John. Ignatius of Antioch especially knew John. He was like the disciple of John. He wrote a lot of stuff. There's some forgeries that come later, but it's pretty easy to see which ones are which. I believe in 7 authentic ones. I think there's, well, I divide them up between 7, 3, and 1 because, you know, how sure you, well, that gets into a whole different thing. Then you have Polycarp, and then after him, Justin Martyr. And then Justin Martyr knew Irenaeus. Now, throughout this time that Christianity's beginning, there's Ignatius of Antioch, who was probably before the year 100 when he was writing. So he was around the turn of the century. It called Christianity, you know, as opposed to a lot of these heresies, Catholic, universal, for all mankind, for the woman, the slave, the Jew, the barbarian. It was for the world. And also in the sense that it was the universal teaching that all the apostles agreed. Now there were other offshoots like Marcionism, which in the mid-2nd century, probably about 120 or 150, becomes a Christian, thinks it's fantastic, reads basically the sources about Christ, some of the stuff that would eventually make it in the New Testament, probably some stuff that didn't. He reads this, he's like, this is great. Christ came to earth, it's a peaceful God, wanting peace, this is beautiful. And then he reads the Jewish scriptures, the Septuagint, gets pissed. Says there's no way that there's a good, that the God of the New Testament, and I don't even want to call it the New Testament, it's not the New Testament yet, it's not the canon that we know as the New Testament yet. The God of the Christian writings is not the God of the Old Testament. It's two different, I mean, that God is a bloodthirsty God. So he theorized, well, Christ was not flesh, he just appeared. You know, he could walk on sand and not leave footprints and all this other kind of stuff, and that the God of the Old Testament was this evil God that created the world, created the universe, anything physical. So the physical was bad, the spiritual was good. Coincidentally, this is one belief that he had in common with another group called the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics were very elitist. It wasn't anybody can join. It wasn't anybody can be saved. You had to learn these sayings and like almost like Zen koans. And Gnosticism was always in a minority. It didn't appeal to the poor, the women, things like this. It was a lot of the times it was ascetic. A lot of times we get reports that it was just people didn't care. They're like, oh, I'm saved by God, therefore I can do anything I want, and have orgies and get drunk and stuff like that. Which we see emerge as the ranters in England in about, 16th, 17th century. And they believed that there were these emanations coming off of God, and that there was a God so stupid called the Demiurge that created the world, and that Christ was totally alien God. Christ and the Father and the Holy Spirit were totally alien, and a lot of times they turn the Holy Spirit into feminine, you know, Sophia or whatever, kind of did strange things with it. And that, you know, like the snake in the Garden of Eden, that was actually God. That was the true God. Just all this weird stuff. But Marcionism and Gnosticism were rejected right off the bat. As soon as the church heard about Marcion's belief, when he came back, and he was the one that really sparked an idea of a canon, because he had eviscerated a lot of the works of Paul, taken all Old Testament references out, and had eviscerated Luke, taken out the virgin birth story, taken out the resurrection, crucifixion, and he's got his own book. Well, as soon as the church heard about this, they're like, "You're out. This is totally alien to what we've ever heard of or believed. We're merely passing down the teachings of Christ." And it's funny. Now, this isn't with Marcion, but we actually found one of Marcion's Gospels, a Gospel attributed to Marcion, which is probably Marcionite, because it wasn't a part of Marcion. Marcionitism lasted a long time after Marcion. There was a point when there were more Marcion bishops than there were Catholic bishops, or called Christian bishops. Then you had the Gnostics, which some of their books are so ridiculous, it's like, and one of them begins something like this: "I, John, yeah, Jesus told you guys that, and you know about all that kind of stuff. Basically, four Gospels and all that stuff. But I, John, he pulled aside in secret and told me the real teachings and secrets to life." And after I read that, I'm like, yeah, no. First of all, this probably wasn't written by John. It was probably put on there for, tack on a name. Gnostics did that all the time. And then it's just BS. It's like a cult leader thing. It's like, wait, Jesus went around preaching for 3 years, had 12 apostles. At one point there were 70 disciples, and there was like 300 disciples, and all these followers. He's talking to everybody for 3 years. And apparently the Apostle John is the only one that gets the wisdom, and doesn't tell it to anybody else, and doesn't tell it to his two successors. It's kind of crazy. So there's a lot of weird foolishness, and the first 2 centuries of Christianity are documented well, and then the 3rd and 4th are extremely well. So it's not as if there's this dark period of time. Now, the compilation of the New Testament, as we know it today, did not happen until about a good 375 years after the works of the New Testament were written. They're early. This is not me bashing the Bible. But sola scriptura is totally ridiculous, and taking literal readings of a lot of especially anything in the Old Testament, like a super literal reading, or that's where you get your theology from, is kind of cracked out. The church had existed for a long period before this stuff started even getting written down. Starting to get written down because people were dying, and they didn't, or it getting passed along. Well, that's for the Gospels. For the epistles, those got circulated. But there were other strange break-offs, like Cerinthianism and all this other strange stuff, and Sethians, and these are Gnostics. The Sethians, Valentinians, Nag Hammadi. They dug up writings of who. It was probably a bunch of different stuff that got buried. But it wasn't by any command of a bishop or anything like this. It's like trying to add 2 and 2 and getting 58 or something. It's ridiculous. But I'll get into Athanasius, how the Bible, from him to how getting the Bible together. Constantine did not write the Bible. Dias Paladin compile the Bible, and the Bible wasn't compiled at Nicaea, and Marcionism wasn't discussed at Nicaea. He claimed all this stuff in a video, and I had to correct him on it. Apparently he's like a professor, not a professor of religion, I can tell you that one right now, since I schooled him on that. But yeah, so I'll get into the compilation of the Bible later on. Well, I should go over this before I end. is that in 70 A.D., the Romans had enough of the Jews and they destroyed the temple. Now this was predicted by Christ, and many people could say, oh, many people can see this, and then there's some scholars that say, well, this means it has to be written after this point, as if you couldn't see the tensions between the Romans and the Jews. So a lot of them will try to put everything after 70 AD, which I think is foolish, because there's things in there that show that it was before that time. So this is confirmed now. Oh my God, Christ, knew this was going to happen. And then he writes about a future war, which I think is the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is 135 AD. And that's when they said they had it. They renamed the land of what was Decapolis, Galilee, the Judea. They renamed it after their ancient enemies, the Philistines, but they couldn't say Philistines, so they called it Palestine. So in AD 70, you had the destruction of the temple, and I think just the expulsion from Jerusalem of the Jews. And then by 135, they said, out of the land. We can't have this. There's too many wars. There's too many fightings. Because there had been fighting going on since Judas Maccabeus years ago, and the Jews were fiercely independent people. But we're around 135. I told you about, the writings that would come, I think it's like 2 something that Irenaeus is writing. But in this, the Bar Kokhba wrote just after it is, I believe, Justin Martyr. But yeah, I'll start getting into later. Well, actually, I probably should cover Cyprian and Augustine too, and the rise of the West. But I'll save that for another video. All right, peace to you. May God save Serbia and Syria. And again, when I say Catholic, I'm not talking about Roman Catholic. I'm talking about the Christianity that survived, that would read the 4 Gospels and say, yes, I believe this. The rest of the Christians, no, they had their own Gospels and their own Bibles, their own view on Christ. So I'm just giving the basic thing. I'm not trying to make it biased. Peace to you. May God save Serbia and Syria. This has been Yusuf. Where the hell is that thing? Oh, there it is. Daniel gives about a 200-year period where the Christ can come, has to come at that point. So there was tons of people who would call themselves Christ. Even there was a group that claimed to be the followers of John the Baptist that call him Christ, and they're old. They're at least from before the time of Islam. So in the book of Acts, talks about the followers of John years after the crucifixion. So they're still around. So there was just, there were a lot of messiahs, the last one being Bar Kokhba in 135 AD, and in 135 AD, the Romans said, we've had enough, but Christians, and they have no concept of what went down. They know that they reject the Roman Catholic Church. Well, no, they don't. They know that they do reject the Roman Catholic Church. It's just, they're not, they just, it's basically myth and legend. It's very strange. And I think it's a view that's held that, there's so many variants of the strange view that's held. So I'm just going to give a basic rundown. I'll lead up to that. Hold on. So you have this guy Jesus, called Christ, sometimes Jesus of Nazareth, who his followers thought were the Christ. You get Christianity spreading like a wildfire. From that point, it just spreads all over, and the message is pretty much the same. There's a miracle worker called Christ, named Christ. There's this new way. It's this totally new religion, and it's monotheistic. So Rome didn't like that. Okay, again, doing this for differentiation of videos, so I'm not uploading them directly to YouTube. There have been people out there, I don't want to start ripping on people, but who it just back and forth. I mean, I keep asking, what's your Skype? Let's talk, because they say things that are so, like, insane. I mean, it's unreal. These are people who claim to be Christians, or according to them, they're of what happened through the years, and I don't know, might span a few videos or whatever. But this is just the basic thing that would happen. I don't know if this isn't cited either to be Eastern Orthodox, Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Anglican, Roman Catholic. So I'm not citing it in any. Basically, everyone agrees on these. Even atheists agree on this. There's a guy known as Jesus, who his followers called the Christ, the awaited Christ, because there was like